There's an anti-1080 video that's being shown around quite a bit at the moment, and the central accusation is from an American scientist, Whiting O'Keefe, and he's basically saying that Department of Conservation research is flawed and it's biased, and that 1080 is quite likely very harmful to our birds and to our native forests. What would you have to say to those accusations?
Well, I'd say that that's Whiting O'Keefe's personal opinion, and that the studies that the department have done and are in, credible scientific journals that are peer-reviewed by non-Department of Conservation scientists from around the country and in some cases internationally. They're all out there, published, number of published papers. And
can you give us an example of where one might go to find such papers?
Go to the New Zealand Journal of Ecology, top journal. 3/4 of papers that are submitted to them are rejected because they're not of a high enough quality. So the ones that were published there are high quality and they're all peer-reviewed. So we dispute that that there's no credible science out there.
Now, the third concern from Whiting O'Keefe is that there's not been a single ecosystem level study showing lack of harm, let alone showing the overwhelming beneficial effects that DOC claims.
Sure. Well, ecosystems are extremely complicated things, and there are very few ecosystem as a whole studies anywhere because you can't describe everything that's happening in an ecosystem. So naturally in science what we use are indicators, and we use indicator species, which means that we pick something like the birds that we're trying to protect and we say, is it of benefit to them? And if it is of benefit to them, it's likely to be of benefit to the rest of the system, or at least most of the rest of the system. Okay.
Yeah, that's interesting. Let's take an indicator species like kiwi.
Sure.
Because in the DVD, kiwi is singled out as being obviously our iconic bird, and there seems to be some allegations or some concern that they are vulnerable to 1080 poisoning. Yeah,
well, I looked at the kiwi section and I was impressed, to be honest. They were very careful not to say that kiwi are being poisoned by 1080. They put kiwi and they took some pictures of kiwi in Stewart Island and they talked about 1080 and they speculated that maybe are kiwi at risk, but there's no evidence, and I think they're actually quite careful to say that there's no evidence. Because there is no evidence. In fact, the evidence is heavily weighted in the opposite direction. We've monitored over 200 individual kiwi with radio collars after aerial 1080 operations. Not one single one has been killed. We have also studied the survivalship of chicks. We know that in kiwi populations, it's stoats, and particularly stoats killing chicks. That's the main thing that's holding them back in a lot of places. And for instance, in Tomareiro National Park in 2006, before an aerial 1080 operation, there was only about 5 to 10% of kiwi chicks that were surviving. They were all being eaten by stoats. After the aerial 1080 operation, 64% of the kiwi chicks that we monitored survived. So that is immense, from 5% to 64%. And Whiting O'Keefe says, well, measuring the number of chicks that, extra chicks that are born doesn't mean that there's a population level effect. But what we do know is that the chick stage is where kiwi are being held back in most cases. And so by having that many more chicks, it means that there is a population increase. We're quite happy that there's no chance of kiwi being, nobbled by 1080. And if there were, why would we be using it?
What about the Kia? 7 Kia died in Franz Joseph, I think, in 2007.
Track 5. Kia.
Back in 2008, we lost 7 kia due to them eating toxic 1080 baits in an operation which was just north of Fox Glacier. So it became obvious that there was an urgent need for research into the effects of aerial 1080 operations on kia, which means now we have a 3-year project during which time we're catching kia at 4 different 1080 sites throughout the South Island and fitting those birds with radio transmitters. We're then able to follow the birds through the 1080 drop and assess their survival. And on top of that, we're going to look at the nesting success of the kia to see whether or not 1080 baiting actually increases the productivity of their nests. To do this, we have to find nest sites both within areas where they're doing baiting and in areas where they're not doing 1080. So we've got another 2 sites adjacent to areas where they're going to drop 1080, where we're catching kia and fitting them with transmitters for the sole purpose of finding their nests and assessing the productivity of those nests in an area where there's no 1080 or predator control of any kind.
The first test of a safe standard aerial 1080 recipe for use in kia areas was successful this year, with 13 radio tagged kia all surviving an aerial 1080 operation in the Mount Arthur region of Kahurangi National Park. The next phase of the research in this site is to measure the nesting success of the kia in that area where the possums, rats and stoats have been controlled with aerial 1080, comparing the nesting success to that of a neighbouring population of kia where there's been no pest control. Now, the safe standard recipe involves using the lowest possible sowing rates, the pellet type that degrades fastest in rain and is less palatable to kia, not sowing above the tree line.
You know, and in any case, you know, the way that we use 1080 is an evolving thing. You know, back in the 70s or whenever it was that we started using it, you know, there was no GPS or anything like that. It was just dump the stuff and it was all really coarse. And over the period of the decades, we've tightened up immensely on the way that we deal with these things. You know, far better screening of baits so that you don't get the little chaff, little bits of bait that was such a problem for things like robins and tomtits and some of the earlier operations, or the operations in the 90s. Some of the earlier operations we were sowing 20 kilos per hectare of carrot bait, and now, you know, 3 kilos per hectare. So the rates have dropped away enormously. But at the same time, with our technology improvements through, you know, use of helicopters and GPS particularly, and much better sowing equipment that you know, provides a very even spread of baits, it means that even though we're using far less toxin out there, we're getting much greater effect on the possum population particularly. You know, we were measuring that, we're seeing that we're killing, you know, 90% of the possum population with far less bait. So it's an evolving science.
We're in the Landsborough Valley in South Westland, and this is a pretty special place. Very good biodiversity values here. It's a stronghold for the yellowhead or mohua, which are in serious decline around the country. They used to be widespread through the northern and western parts of the South Island. But now they're only found in small remnant pockets of beech forest. And as well as the mohua, we have lots of other forest birds here, kaka, kakariki, there's a good population of kea, and also there are bats in the valley, so it's a very special place for wildlife. In order to protect these biodiversity values in the Landsborough, we've got an integrated management system in place. So we've got a large network of stoat traps, 280 tunnels, each with double set traps in, and that runs through pretty much the whole of the mid-Landsborough. And primarily that's to protect the mohua, although it obviously will benefit the other forest life as well, such as the kakariki or the kaka, and also the bats. And in addition to that, to protect the scarlet mistletoe, there's a regular 1080 drop that happens once every few years when the possum numbers get high. But what we're more recently trying to do is tie that 1080 drop in to also control plague numbers of rodents during heavy masting years, which is when the beech seeds very heavily.